The words, "We need you to leave, Mom," were delivered by my son, David, with an unnerving calmness, a chilling detachment that sliced through me far more effectively than any raised voice or angry outburst could have. He stood in the doorway of what had been my bedroom for the past 5 years, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but for a certain hard set to his jaw that I recognized, it was the look he got when he'd made an immutable decision, usually one that served his own interests above all others. Behind him, hovering like a nervous shadow, was his wife, Susan, her eyes darting everywhere but at me, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. The news of my job loss, a casualty of corporate restructuring at the library, where I'd worked for 27 years, was barely a week old. The severance package was modest, the future uncertain. I had, naively it now seemed, expected sympathy, support, perhaps even a rallying of familial spirit. Instead, I was being handed an eviction notice, cloaked in the flimsy excuse of needing the space now that their youngest, Lily, was getting bigger. Lily was 4. The lie was so transparent it was insulting. This wasn't about space, it was about perceived burden. I was no longer Margaret, the dependable mother, the live-in babysitter, the quiet contributor to household bills from my steady, if modest, librarian salary. I was now Margaret, the unemployed dependent, a sudden drain on their carefully curated middle-class lifestyle. The speed of their decision, the cold efficiency of it, left me reeling. "David," I began, my voice a hoarse whisper, "where am I supposed to go?" I need a little time," he shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture that spoke volumes. "There are places, Mom. Shelters, maybe some of those senior living apartments." Susan found a few brochures. "We just can't. It's not feasible for you to stay here indefinitely without contributing. We have our own family to think about, our own family." The implication was clear. I was no longer considered a part of it. The pain was a physical entity, a crushing weight on my chest that made it difficult to breathe. This was my son, the boy I had raised, sacrificing my own ambitions, my own comforts, to ensure he had everything he needed. This was the man who, just last Christmas, had tearfully thanked me for my unwavering support throughout his life. Had it all been a performance? A means to an end? The small, threadbare suitcase they had presumably packed for me sat by the door, a pathetic symbol of my sudden dispossession. I looked at it, then back at David's impassive face. A spark of anger, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of my shock and grief. He saw a destitute old woman, a liability. He had no inkling, not the faintest suspicion, of the truth I had guarded so carefully for over a decade, a truth nestled securely in offshore accounts and diversified investments, a truth that could buy his comfortable suburban house 10 times over. This secret, a legacy from my own fiercely independent mother, had been my silent shield, my private comfort, a resource I had hoped never to truly need, especially not against my own child. But as I looked at his unyielding face, at Susan's averted gaze, I knew its purpose was about to change. It would no longer be a shield, it would become my sword. They thought they were casting me out into the storm. They had no idea I owned the goddamn weather. The silence in the taxi, as it pulled away from the house I had shared with my son and his family, was a deafening counterpoint to the turmoil raging within me. David hadn't even offered to call the cab. Susan had done that, her voice a low murmur on the phone, her eyes still avoiding mine. They had stood on the porch, 2 stiff figures watching me go, their relief almost palpable even from a distance. There were no hugs, no promises to visit, no expressions of regret, however insincere. Just the blank, final closing of a door on a chapter of my life I had, until that very morning, believed was rooted in love and mutual respect. Now, I saw it for what it was, a transaction, and my value had apparently expired. The driver, a kind-faced man with weary eyes, occasionally glanced at me in the rearview mirror, perhaps sensing my distress, but he remained blessedly silent. I had given him the address of a small, clean, but unremarkable motel on the outskirts of town, the first place that had come to mind, a temporary refuge while I gathered my thoughts and my strength. The threadbare suitcase on the seat beside me contained a haphazard collection of clothes, a few toiletries, and a framed photograph of my late husband, Arthur, his smile a painful reminder of a time when love felt unconditional, when family meant unwavering support. Arthur. He would have been appalled by David's actions, heartbroken by the callousness. It was Arthur's prudent investments, coupled with the inheritance from my mother, that formed the bulk of my secret fortune. He had always insisted on financial independence for me, a safeguard against unforeseen storms. "You never know, Maggie," he used to say, "when you might need to stand entirely on your own 2 feet. Best to have solid ground beneath them." How right he had been. The irony was that David knew nothing of this, had always assumed we were comfortable, but by no means wealthy. We had lived modestly, prioritizing his education, his opportunities, over material extravagances. It had been a conscious choice, a belief that character and security were built on more than just money. Perhaps that had been my mistake, shielding him too much from the realities of financial planning, allowing him to develop a sense of entitlement without a corresponding sense of responsibility or gratitude. As I checked into the anonymous motel room, the scent of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner clinging to the air, the full weight of his betrayal pressed down on me. This wasn't just about being kicked out, it was about the utter lack of compassion, the cold calculation that had clearly preceded the act. How long had they been planning this? Had my job loss simply been the convenient trigger they were waiting for? The questions gnawed at me, each one a fresh stab of pain. I sank onto the edge of the lumpy bed, the cheap bedspread rough beneath my fingers. For a long moment, I allowed the despair to wash over me, the tears to flow freely. But then, through the grief, that spark of anger I'd felt earlier began to glow, to burn with a fierce, steady heat. This was not how my story would end. This motel room was not my final destination. David and Susan thought they had disposed of a burden. They had no idea they had just unleashed a force. My secret fortune wasn't just a collection of stocks and bonds. It was a testament to my resilience, my foresight, and the love of those who had truly cared for me. And I would use it, not just to survive, but to demonstrate, in no uncertain terms, the magnitude of their miscalculation. The game was not over, it had merely entered a new, unexpected phase, and I, Margaret Ainsworth, held all the winning cards. The first few days in the motel were a blow of numbness and a slow, simmering rage. I allowed myself to grieve for the loss of my job, yes, but more profoundly, for the loss of my son, or at least the son I thought I knew. The David who had coldly shown me the door was a stranger, a chilling caricature of the loving boy I had raised. I replayed memories in my mind, searching for clues, for a point where he might have diverged so sharply from the values I had tried to instill in him. Had Susan's influence been so corrosive? Or was this mercenary streak something that had always lurked within him, hidden beneath a veneer of filial affection? The brochures Susan had found, those glossy pamphlets for soulless senior living solutions, were a particular point of festering anger. They hadn't even bothered to discuss my preferences, my desires. They had simply decided my fate, packaging it as a kindness. The arrogance was staggering. But grief and anger, I knew, were unproductive beyond a certain point. They needed to be channeled, transformed into action. Arthur's voice echoed in my memory, "Don't just get mad, Maggie, get smart," and so, on the third day, I began to get smart. My first call was not to a new real estate agent, nor to a luxury car dealership. tempting as those minor symbolic victories might have been. It was to Mr. Alastair Finch, my long-time financial advisor and solicitor, a man of impeccable discretion and formidable intellect, the only other living soul who knew the true extent of my wealth. Alastair had been a friend of Arthur's, and after Arthur's passing, he had seamlessly taken over the stewardship of my portfolio, his guidance proving invaluable over the years. "Margaret, my dear," his voice, calm and reassuring, came down the line from his discreetly opulent city office. "I was wondering when I might hear from you. I saw the news about the library closures. A shame. How are you holding up?" I recounted the events of the past few days, my voice surprisingly steady as I detailed David and Susan's callous actions, the eviction, the threadbare suitcase. Alastair listened without interruption, a skill I had always admired in him. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, then, "The ungrateful whelp," he said, his tone uncharacteristically sharp. "After everything you and Arthur did for him. I am so very sorry, Margaret, that you've been subjected to this." His genuine sympathy was a balm. "But," he continued, his voice regaining its usual brisk efficiency, "knowing you, you haven't called me merely to commiserate. You have a plan, or the beginnings of one, I suspect the very beginnings, Alastair," I confirmed, a grim smile touching my lips. "They think I'm destitute, a burden. They think they've washed their hands of me. I intend to disabuse them of that notion, rather spectacularly music to my ears," he chuckled. "Your portfolio, as you know, is in excellent health. Extremely robust, in fact. You have considerable liquid assets at your immediate disposal, and your property investments continue to yield handsome returns. What, precisely, did you have in mind? A comfortable new residence, perhaps? A world cruise? Both are well within your means, of course, all in good time, Alastair," I said. "For now, I need something more strategic. I need to understand David and Susan's financial situation. They live comfortably, but I suspect they are stretched thin, always aspiring to the next material acquisition. I want to know their vulnerabilities." Alastair was silent for a moment. "That can be ascertained, discreetly, of course." "And then?" "And then," I said, the cold anger coiling within me, "we shall see. For now, I need a comfortable, but very private, place to stay. Not a motel. Something more fitting for a woman of means who is plotting her comeback." He chuckled again. "I have just the place. A serviced apartment, very secure, very discreet, in a rather pleasant part of town they are unlikely to frequent. I can have the arrangements made by this afternoon. And Margaret, don't worry about the cost. Consider it a retainer for the entertainment value this is likely to provide me." The conversation with Alastair was a turning point. It shifted me from victim to protagonist, from despair to determination. My secret fortune, once a quiet comfort, was now an active weapon, and I had a very skilled general to help me wield it. David and Susan had kicked me out, believing me to be a broken, penniless old woman. They had no idea, they had just signed their own writ of poetic justice. The serviced apartment Alastair arranged was an oasis of understated luxury. Located in a beautifully restored Victorian building in a quiet, leafy crescent, it was a world away from the depressing motel, and, more importantly, a universe removed from David and Susan's suburban bubble. It was spacious, elegantly furnished, with high ceilings, large windows overlooking a private garden, and a discreet daily housekeeping service. For the first time in days, I felt I could breathe properly. There was a sense of anonymity here, a freedom from prying eyes, that was exactly what I needed to plan my next moves. Alastair, true to his word, began his discreet inquiries into David and Susan's financial affairs. It didn't take long for a picture to emerge. They were, as I suspected, living right up to the edge of their income, possibly beyond. A large mortgage on their perfect family home, 2 expensive car leases, hefty school fees for Lily's private nursery, and a penchant for designer labels and aspirational holidays had left them with very little financial cushion. Susan, I learned, had recently scaled back her part-time interior design consultancy to focus more on Lily, a decision that had likely put further strain on their finances, a strain my modest but regular contribution to the household bills had probably, unknowingly, been alleviating. They were, in essence, a house of cards, vulnerable to the slightest financial breeze. And I, their recently evicted, supposedly destitute mother, was about to become a gale. My strategy wasn't about immediate, flashy revenge. That would be too crude, too obvious. No, my approach would be more subtle, a slow, creeping realization on their part of the colossal mistake they had made. I wanted them to feel the consequences of their actions, not through a sudden explosion, but through a gradual erosion of their comfortable, complacent world. While Alastair gathered information, I began to rebuild my own life, quietly and purposefully. I opened new bank accounts, transferred funds, and started to explore investment opportunities that were more active, more visible, than my previous, deliberately low-profile portfolio. I also began to think about what I truly wanted for myself, now that I was unshackled from the perceived obligations of family. The library, my former place of work, had been a sanctuary, a place of quiet order and intellectual stimulation. I missed it, but I also realized that its loss had, in a strange way, liberated me. I was no longer defined by my role as a librarian, nor by my role as David's mother. I was simply Margaret Ainsworth, a woman of independent means, with a blank canvas before her. One of my first significant actions was to make a substantial, anonymous donation to the city's public library system, specifically earmarked for the very outreach programs that had been cut due to restructuring the programs I had championed. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet take that to the forces that had rendered me unemployed, but it also brought me a deep sense of satisfaction. I was using my wealth not just for myself, but to support something I believed in. The irony that David and Susan were likely bemoaning their tight budget, perhaps even regretting the loss of my small financial contribution, while I was casually donating sums that would dwarf their annual income, was not lost on me. It was a taste of the poetic justice to come, a quiet foreshadowing of the power I now wielded, a power they had so foolishly and callously dismissed. While I settled into my new life, meticulously planning my next steps with Alastair, I couldn't help but wonder how David and Susan were faring. Had my abrupt departure caused any ripples in their carefully curated existence beyond the initial relief of having solved their mom problem? I imagined Susan was probably enjoying the extra space, perhaps already mentally redecorating my former room into a home office, or a playroom for Lily. David, I suspected, had likely compartmentalized his actions, convincing himself that he had done what was necessary, perhaps even noble, for the sake of his real family. The lack of any attempt to contact me, even a cursory text to see if I had found shelter, spoke volumes. It confirmed their utter indifference, their complete lack of remorse. This, more than anything, solidified my resolve. There would be no easy path to reconciliation, no tearful apologies accepted without profound, demonstrated change on their part. They had burned their bridges with a casual flick of a match, and I was in no hurry to rebuild them. Alastair's reports continued to paint a picture of a couple under increasing financial strain. Without my contribution to the bills, however small they might have deemed it, certain luxuries were apparently becoming harder to maintain. There were whispers, picked up by Alastair's discreet sources, of arguments over money, of cancelled holiday plans, of Susan expressing a desire to return to more full-time work, a prospect David, with his traditional views on gender roles, was apparently resisting. Their house of cards was beginning to tremble. Meanwhile, I was rediscovering myself. I started attending art classes, something I'd always wanted to do, but never found the time for. I visited galleries, museums, attended concerts. I bought new clothes, not extravagant designer labels like Susan favored, but elegant, well-made pieces that made me feel confident and comfortable. I even started to think about travel, a real, adventurous trip, not just a week at a seaside resort. The world, which had seemed to shrink to the size of that depressing motel room, was now opening up before me, full of possibilities. My secret fortune was not just a weapon, it was a key, unlocking doors I had long forgotten even existed. One afternoon, Alistair called with a particularly interesting piece of information. David's company was undergoing its own restructuring. Rumors of layoffs were rife. While David's position wasn't immediately threatened, the general atmosphere of uncertainty was apparently causing him considerable stress. He, who had so callously dismissed my job loss, was now facing the same anxieties. The irony was exquisite. I felt no pity, only a grim satisfaction. Perhaps a taste of his own medicine would provide a much-needed lesson in empathy, though I doubted it. His primary concern, I suspected, would be for himself, for the potential disruption to his comfortable life. My plan began to take a more definite shape. It wasn't enough for them to simply feel the pinch of my absence. I wanted them to understand, unequivocally, what they had thrown away, who they had discarded. And for that, I needed to make my new circumstances known, not directly, not yet, but in a way that would be impossible for them to ignore. A way that would shatter their smug assumptions about my supposed destitution. The seeds of my quiet, devastating revenge were being carefully sown, watered by their own arrogance and indifference. The opportunity to begin the more visible phase of my plan presented itself through an unlikely avenue, a charity art auction. It was a high-profile event, organized by one of the city's leading philanthropic families, the kind of gathering frequented by the city's affluent and socially ambitious, precisely the sort of event Susan would aspire to attend, or at least read about avidly in the society pages. Alistair, who was on the board of several charitable foundations, secured me an invitation. My initial thought was simply to attend, to be seen, perhaps to make a modest purchase. But as I perused the auction catalogue, a particular painting caught my eye, the beautiful landscape by a renowned local artist, an artist whose work Susan had often publicly admired, lamenting that it was far beyond their reach. A wicked, audacious idea began to form. The auction itself was a glittering affair, held in the grand ballroom of a historic hotel. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple but exquisitely cut deep emerald green dress, a string of pearls that had belonged to my mother, and a newfound confidence that felt surprisingly natural. I felt not like an imposter, but like a woman coming into her own. Alistair, dapper and distinguished, was my escort, his presence lending an additional air of gravitas. I scanned the room, and sure enough, I spotted them. David and Susan. They were standing near the edge of the crowd, looking slightly out of place, their expressions a mixture of awe and aspiration. Susan's eyes were devouring the room, no doubt taking mental notes on the fashion, the jewelry, the general air of effortless wealth. David looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his tie. They hadn't seen me yet. The painting I was interested in came up midway through the auction. The bidding started briskly, quickly climbing. I let others drive the price up, waiting, observing. I saw Susan nudge David, pointing at the painting, her expression wistful. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, a gesture of financial constraint that I found deeply satisfying. When the bidding seemed to be slowing, just as the auctioneer was about to bring the gavel down, I raised my paddle. A hush fell over our section of the room. All eyes turned to me. I saw Susan's head snap in my direction, her eyes widening in disbelief. David followed her gaze, his jaw literally dropping. Their shock was a palpable wave that washed over me, invigorating and triumphant. I kept my expression serene, offering a small, confident nod to the auctioneer. Another bidder challenged me, but I met their price and raised it again, and then again, without hesitation. The sums were significant, amounts that would have once seemed astronomical to me, but now felt entirely manageable. Finally, with a decisive rap of the gavel, the painting was mine. "Sold, to the lady in green," the auctioneer announced. Applause rippled through the room. I allowed myself a small, dignified smile, acutely aware of David and Susan's stunned, incredulous stares. They looked as if they'd seen a ghost, a very well-dressed, unexpectedly wealthy ghost. The message, I knew, had been delivered, loud and clear, without me uttering a single word to them. Their discarded, destitute mother was not only surviving, she was thriving, moving in circles they could only dream of, casually acquiring luxuries they coveted. The seed of doubt, the first tremor in the foundation of their arrogant assumptions, had been planted. This was just the beginning of their education. The aftermath of the art auction was, as I had anticipated, quite satisfying. Alastair informed me that news of my rather conspicuous purchase had spread quickly through certain social circles, accompanied by a great deal of speculation about the mystery woman who had outbid several prominent collectors. More importantly, I knew David and Susan would be reeling, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of their destitute, evicted mother with the confident, affluent woman they had witnessed at the auction. Their carefully constructed narrative about my helplessness had been blown apart. I didn't wait for them to contact me. I knew their pride, or perhaps their shame, would prevent any immediate approach. Instead, I continued with the next phase of my plan, establishing a very visible, very comfortable new life for myself. With Alastair's expert assistance, I purchased a beautiful penthouse apartment in one of the city's most desirable new developments, a building known for its luxury amenities and stunning views. It was the antithesis of the cramped granny flat I had occupied in David's house, and certainly a world away from the depressing motel. I hired a reputable interior designer, not Susan, though the thought did cross my mind with a flicker of malicious amusement, and set about creating a home that was truly my own, filled with art, books, and comfortable, elegant furnishings. My days were filled with purpose. I became more involved in charitable work, joining the boards of several organizations that aligned with my values, including the Library Foundation I had initially supported anonymously. My name began to appear in connection with significant donations and successful fundraising initiatives. I was no longer Margaret Ainsworth, the forgotten mother, but Margaret Ainsworth, philanthropist, patron of the arts, a respected member of the community. These activities were not solely for David and Susan's benefit, of course. I found genuine fulfillment in using my wealth to make a positive impact. But the knowledge that my rising profile would inevitably reach them, that they would be forced to confront the reality of who I had become, added a certain piquant satisfaction to my endeavors. Alastair also made sure that certain, carefully chosen pieces of information found their way into the public domain. For instance, when I endowed a scholarship fund for underprivileged students at the local university, David's alma mater, my name, and the substantial size of the endowment, were prominently featured in the university's alumni newsletter, a publication I knew David received. The silence from David and Susan continued, but I imagined their home was filled with increasingly frantic, bewildered conversations. How could this be? Where had the money come from? Had I been deceiving them all along? The questions, I hoped, were causing them considerable discomfort, forcing them to reevaluate not just my circumstances, but their own character, their own appalling behavior. My revenge was not about causing them financial ruin, though I could have easily engineered such a thing. It was about something far more profound, forcing them to confront the truth of their own moral bankruptcy, to understand the magnitude of the respect and love they had so casually discarded. I was holding up a mirror to their ugliness, and the reflection, I suspected, was not a pleasant one for them to behold. The first direct contact came not as a phone call or a visit, but as a cautiously worded email from David. It arrived nearly 3 months after the art auction, a period during which my public profile had continued to rise, and, as Alistair discreetly informed me, their own financial anxieties had deepened due to some unexpected household repairs and a downturn in David's year-end bonus. The email was a masterpiece of awkward conciliation, devoid of any real apology, but heavy with an undercurrent of bewildered curiosity. "Dear Mom," it began, the salutation itself feeling foreign after so long. "I hope this email finds you well. Susan and I were surprised to see you at the charity auction a while ago. We've also heard, well, we've heard you seem to be doing very well for yourself. We were wondering, perhaps we could meet for coffee sometime. Just to talk, just to talk." As if the chasm between us could be bridged by a casual chat over cappuccinos. As if his kicking me out, when he thought I was penniless, was a minor misunderstanding that could be easily smoothed over now that he suspected I had money. The audacity was still breathtaking, but it was now tinged with a pathetic desperation that I found almost pitiable, though not enough to sway my resolve. I let the email sit in my inbox for a week, a small act of passive resistance, allowing him to wonder, to fret. When I finally replied, my response was brief, polite, and non-committal. "David," I wrote. "Thank you for your email. I am indeed doing very well. As for meeting, my schedule is rather full at present with my various commitments. Perhaps at some point in the future. Sincerely, Margaret." I deliberately used my full name, a subtle underscoring of the distance between us, a reminder that I was no longer just Mom, the subservient figure they had taken for granted. The message was clear: I was in control. I would dictate the terms of any future interaction, if indeed there was to be any. The satisfaction of hitting send was immense. It was a small victory, but a significant one. I was no longer the supplicant, the discarded burden. I was the one with the power, the one they now, belatedly, sought. Alistair, when I recounted the exchange, chuckled approvingly. "Masterfully handled, Margaret. Let them stew in their own curiosity and regret. They need to understand that forgiveness, if it is ever to be granted, will be on your terms, and only after genuine, profound atonement, and genuine, profound atonement, I knew, was a concept that was likely still far beyond David's comprehension. His email was not an act of contrition, it was an exploratory mission, a tentative probe to see if the newly discovered goldmine that was his mother might be accessible. His motivations, I suspected, were still rooted in self-interest, not in any true remorse for the pain he had caused. My life continued to flourish. I hosted a small, elegant dinner party in my new penthouse for some of my new friends and associates from the charitable boards. I booked a 2-week trip to Tuscany, something I'd dreamed of for years. I was, for the first time in a very long time, living life entirely for myself, and it was wonderfully liberating. The shadow of David and Susan's betrayal still lingered, a faint scar on my heart, but it no longer defined me. It had become, instead, the catalyst for my rebirth, the unintentional gift that had forced me to reclaim my own power, my own worth, and my own very substantial fortune. The Tuscan trip was everything I had dreamed of and more. I wandered through sun-drenched vineyards, explored ancient hilltop towns, indulged in glorious food and wine, and simply revelled in the beauty and tranquility of the Italian countryside. For 2 blissful weeks, I didn't think about David or Susan, or the intricate dance of my quiet revenge. I simply allowed myself to be happy, to soak in the richness of life, a privilege my newfound freedom and fortune afforded me. Upon my return, tanned and rejuvenated, there was another email from David waiting in my inbox. This one was longer, more overtly pleading, though still lacking the depth of genuine remorse I knew would be necessary for any true reconciliation. He spoke of misunderstandings, of stressful times that had led to decisions we now regret. He mentioned Lily, how she sometimes asked about her Nana, a blatant attempt to tug at my heartstrings. He even hinted at their own financial challenges, a thinly veiled appeal for assistance. We were hoping, Mom, he wrote, that perhaps you might find it in your heart to forgive us. We miss you. And honestly, things have been difficult. I read the email with a cool detachment. The difficult things he referred to were, I knew, largely of their own making, the consequences of their lifestyle choices, and, more recently, the absence of the financial buffer my presence, and my previous, albeit modest, income, had provided. His regret, I sensed, was still primarily for his own discomfort, not for the pain he had inflicted upon me. My response was even cooler than before. David, I replied, I appreciate your candor regarding your current difficulties. However, my financial decisions are now focused on my philanthropic endeavors and securing my own future. The time for me to assist you and Susan financially, or in any other capacity, has passed. That door was closed quite firmly by you some months ago. As for forgiveness, that is a complex matter, not to be earned through emails but through sustained, demonstrable changes in character and behavior. Thus far, I have seen little evidence of either. Margaret, the finality of my tone, the unambiguous refusal to be drawn back into their drama, or to bail them out of their self-inflicted problems, must have been a shock. I imagined the consternation, the panic, that my email would have caused. They had likely hoped that my newfound wealth would translate into renewed generosity towards them, that their prodigal mother, now inexplicably rich, would welcome them back with open arms and an open checkbook. They were, once again, profoundly mistaken. My fortune was mine, to be used as I saw fit. And bailing out my ungrateful son, and his equally culpable wife, was not high on my list of priorities. In fact, it wasn't on the list at all. The true poetic justice was not in their suffering, but in their dawning realization of what they had lost, not just potential access to my wealth, but the unconditional love and support of a mother they had so cruelly and short-sightedly discarded. They had kicked me out when they thought I was a burden. Now, they were learning, in the hardest way possible, that the real burden was their own appalling lack of character. The weeks that followed my blunt email to David were marked by a telling silence from his end. I imagined a mixture of anger, disbelief, and perhaps a dawning, terrifying understanding that the well had truly run dry, that Mom was no longer a resource to be tapped at will. Alistair, ever my discreet eyes and ears, reported that the atmosphere in the David-Susan household was decidedly frosty, with hushed, anxious conversations overheard by the cleaner, and a general air of despondency. Susan had apparently started looking for full-time employment with a renewed, almost desperate, urgency. Good, I thought. A dose of reality might do them both a world of good. My own life, in stark contrast, continued to blossom. I hosted a successful fundraising gala for the Library Foundation, an event that was widely covered in the local press, complete with photographs of me looking poised and radiant. I took up oil painting, discovering a latent talent I never knew I possessed. My penthouse became a haven of peace and creativity, a place where I felt truly myself, unburdened by the expectations or judgments of others. The memory of that threadbare suitcase, of the cold dismissal in David's eyes, still surfaced occasionally, but it no longer had the power to wound me deeply. It was merely a reminder of how far I had come, of the strength I had found within myself. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alastair called me with a particularly interesting piece of news. "Margaret, my dear," he began, a note of suppressed amusement in his voice, "you may find this rather piquant. It seems young David's aspirations to climb the corporate ladder have hit a significant snag. Remember that company he works for, Sterling Corp? Well, I happen to sit on the advisory board of a much larger conglomerate, Apex Industries, which has just launched a rather aggressive takeover bid for Sterling." I listened, intrigued. And Alastair continued, "If the takeover is successful, which I have every reason to believe it will be, there will inevitably be restructuring. Redundancies. David's department, from what I understand, is considered rather bloated and inefficient. His position, shall we say, is far from secure." The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. David, who had used my job loss as a pretext to eject me from his life, was now facing the very real prospect of his own unemployment, at the hands of a corporate entity with which I, through Alastair, had an indirect but influential connection. I said nothing for a moment, absorbing the news. There was no elation, no vindictive joy, just a profound, almost solemn sense of karmic balance. "Will you intervene, Alastair?" I asked quietly. "To ensure his position is safe. Or otherwise?" He chuckled. "My dear Margaret, my role on the Apex board is to advise on strategic financial matters, not on personnel decisions at the junior management level of a potential acquisition. However," he added, his voice laced with meaning, "should his name happen to cross my desk in any capacity, I shall, of course, recall our various conversations about his exemplary character." The unspoken message was clear. I didn't need to lift a finger. The universe, it seemed, had its own ways of delivering poetic justice. My secret fortune had bought me security, freedom, and the ability to live a life of purpose and quiet dignity. It had also, inadvertently or perhaps not, set in motion a chain of events that would force my son to confront the true cost of his callousness, a cost far greater than any amount of money. He had kicked me out, not knowing my true worth. He was about to discover his own. The Apex Industries takeover of Sterling Corp proceeded with swift, ruthless efficiency, just as Alastair had predicted. Within weeks, the deal was finalized, and the inevitable restructuring began. I followed the news with a detached interest, knowing that the ripples of this corporate upheaval would soon reach David's comfortable suburban doorstep. I didn't have to wait long. Less than a month after the takeover, Alastair informed me, with a discreet cough that barely concealed his satisfaction, that David Ainsworth had indeed been made redundant. His department had been one of the first to be streamlined, deemed surplus to requirements by the new Apex management. My reaction was complex. There was no triumphant fist pump, no celebratory glass of champagne. Instead, I felt a quiet, somber sense of an inevitable cycle completing itself. He had sown the wind, now he was reaping the whirlwind. His callous dismissal of my own job loss, his heartless eviction of me when he believed I was vulnerable and penniless, all these actions had come home to roost. The knowledge that I had played no direct hand in his downfall, that my fortune had merely created the circumstances where justice could unfold naturally, was a source of strange comfort. I had not sought revenge in a malicious sense. I had simply removed myself from his life and allowed the consequences of his own character to play out. A few days after losing his job, David called me. His voice was unrecognizable, stripped of its usual arrogance, laced with a raw, desperate panic. "Mom," he choked out, "Mom, I lost my job. They let me go." I listened in silence, offering no immediate sympathy, no soothing platitudes. "I see," I said finally, my voice calm, neutral. "That is unfortunate, David, unfortunate," he almost shrieked. "Mom, it's a disaster. The mortgage, Lily's school, Susan, she's beside herself. We don't know what we are going to do. I hoped, maybe you could help. Just a loan, until I get back on my feet. There it was. The inevitable appeal. Even now, even after everything, his first instinct was to turn to me, the mother he had discarded, assuming that my maternal instincts, or perhaps my newfound wealth, would override the memory of his profound betrayal. David, I said, my voice soft but unyielding, when I lost my job, you told me there were places, shelters. You handed me a suitcase and showed me the door. You advised me that you had your own family to think about, and that it wasn't feasible for me to stay with you without contributing. Do you remember that conversation? A choked silence on the other end of the line. You seem to have managed quite well since then, he eventually mumbled, a hint of sullen resentment creeping into his panic. Indeed, I have, David, I replied. I had resources you were unaware of. Resources I chose not to reveal, perhaps to see the true measure of my son's character. And I must say, the results of that experiment were, illuminating the full weight of his folly, the colossal, life-altering mistake he had made, seemed to finally crash down upon him. The silence stretched, thick with his unspoken regret, his dawning comprehension of the true magnitude of what he had thrown away, not just potential financial security, but a mother's love, a mother's support, all sacrificed on the altar of his own selfish convenience. My advice to you, David, I continued, my voice still quiet, but edged with steel, is the same advice you gave me. There are places. There are solutions. You have a family to think about. It is time for you to stand on your own 2 feet and figure it out. Just as I did, and with those words that echoed his own heartless dismissal of me, I gently ended the call. My son had kicked me out after I lost my job, not knowing I had a secret fortune. He now knew. And he knew, with a certainty that would likely haunt him for the rest of his days, that some doors, once slammed shut, can never truly be reopened. My triumph was not in his ruin, but in my own quiet, unassailable peace, a peace bought with foresight, resilience, and the enduring knowledge of my own worth.